So welcome to our last class of the semester. My hair still looks crazy. Some days it's just the end of the semester and you look like a crazy person. All right. Anyway, so what we're going to be doing today is just, I'm doing pretty well, Hong. We're reaching the end and I'm still kicking, so not too many complaints. All right. So my brain just went blank. All right, here we go. So today what we're going to be doing is just talking about the last part 3 of how to write a paper, and then we get to say goodbye, and I say I will give you grades and all that fun stuff. So for starters, I've started going over the assignments that were due today. Again, I sent an email before. If you didn't get it to me yet, make sure to send it to me ASAP. I'm going to email them back with some comments tomorrow. So expect some feedback on those things at some point tomorrow. Remind me at the end of class to bring up some business points about paper drafts and etc. But regarding the assignment for day, on the whole, you all kicked butt with the theses that I've seen. Ones I've read so far was very clear what the thesis was. It stood out nice and clear. The signposts, one thing I wanted to say about the signposts. With signposts, it's better to err on the side of too much detail than too few. So with a signpost, instead of just saying next, I'll discuss key terms, don't be afraid to say something a little more substantive, like, however, before we get to the core of the argument, it's necessary to define some key terms that I'll rely on later. So the first one, if you just had the next, I'll discuss key terms. It's not a bad signpost. That helps me understand. But when you're writing a paragraph in which you're trying to make this paragraph fit in with a larger overall thing and trying to make everything tie back to your thesis, it's helpful to have this extra level of detail. Not only does it help me, the reader, identify exactly what's to come, but it's also helpful to you as you're writing the thing. You're going to be writing and then the cat's going to walk into the room and you're going to start petting it and you're going to forget what your train of thought was. And then if you have a nice clear signpost like this, you can look back and be like, oh yes, that's right, I'm giving key terms. Why am I doing that again? Oh yes, that's right. This is going to be something I'm going to be referring back to later. Also, if you've written the paper and you get to the end and you then go back and you're reading through and you're like, oh, later on, I'm going to define these terms here, but then I don't actually refer to them later on. Well, then you can make sure to go back in and include those referring back to these terms later in the paper, just because the overall goal is to make it a single cohesive whole that each part fits together and all of it works towards your thesis. So in these little signposts, don't be afraid to go into a lot of detail saying exactly what you're going to do in the paragraph and why. It's just once you have written a lot more, and if you've been doing it for years, you don't need these things, but it can be really helpful the first time you're writing to include this level of detail, or even, I mean, I still, for my own sanity, include this level of detail in my signposts in my own writing. Jessica, did you have a question? I just can't tell whether, I don't want to skip you. Nope, looks like we're okay. So any questions on that thesis assignment or the signpost assignment? Again, like the thesis assignment, you're just being graded on completion. So as long as you turn in something, you'll get full credit. I will be giving you feedback that will help you write the paper. But if you didn't fully do it or your signposts were a little off, don't worry. You're not going to lose credit on that account. As long as you do it, you're getting full credit. All right. Any questions at this point? All right. So what I want to do now is, at this point in your paper writing process, you should have a thesis and you should have about, I don't know, 5 other sentences. So how do we take the thesis and those 5 other sentences and turn it into an entire paper? Well, we already talked about last time what your introduction paragraph should look like. It should start with a description of the case. Then it should have the thesis. And then it can have the game plan or roadmap, where it's just, first I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that. And now we said this next paragraph 2 is going to be the definitions. And then paragraph 3 to whatever is going to be the body paragraphs. Well, how do you actually turn these sentences into overall paragraphs? Well, this is where the real work comes into the paper. And there's no one right way to do this. This is rather where the creativity and where writing becomes an art and not a science. Because the way you go about presenting this is going to have to be, one, what you want and are comfortable with doing, and also doing that in a way that is able to get your point across. So the first step in writing this paper is, one, always keep your own thesis. Remember your thesis and keep it in mind. So what do I mean by that? Well, your overall goal in your paper is to prove to the reader that they should believe what you want them to believe. So in this case, it's that they should believe that you should or shouldn't shoot your best friend Gary, given the circumstances, or that you should or shouldn't allow Carl K. Carlson to have his website, or that you should or shouldn't judge this alien species. So everything that happens in the paper should be working towards proving that point. Just like when you're making a cake or building something for a purpose, you don't want to just start throwing random ingredients into your cake. You want every ingredient you're adding to work towards having a delicious food product. In the same way, you want every sentence, every word in the paper to work towards proving to the reader why your thesis is correct. So keeping that in the back of your mind as you're writing, if you're like, I don't know what to say next. Well, remind yourself, well, what am I trying to argue? And therefore, what would I have to do to make that thesis clear so that my reader can figure out what on earth I'm talking about and why I'm trying to, or how I'm trying to get them to believe it. So another thing to ask yourself whenever you're writing is, why am I including this sentence? And your answer should always go back to your thesis. Well, I'm including this sentence because this defines a certain term, and this term is necessary for explaining my reason, and that reason is important for supporting my thesis. So it's connected in this way. Generally, the easier time you have explaining why you're doing something to yourself, the clearer and easier to follow it is. So that's the first thing. Always remember why you're writing this paper, what your goal is, and everything you do should work towards that goal. Now, I'm speaking very vaguely because there's no one right way of doing this. There are many different ways in which you can work towards that thesis. So I should have gone in a different order. So basically, how should you go about deciding what you need for the remember your thesis? What do you need to do to prove that your thesis is correct? Well, here's where the lazy, stupid, mean comes in. So what do I mean by lazy, stupid, mean? This is how you should treat me as your reader of the paper. This is straight from the James Pryor reading about how to write or guidelines to writing a philosophy paper. And basically, treat me, the person who's reading your paper, as a complete numbskull. Why are you trying to treat me as a numbskull? Well, basically, if you write this paper in a clear, organized enough way that even a numbskull, or I often like to say, imagine you're writing for a drunken first grader. If a drunken first grader could follow your level of arguing, then that's the level of clarity where you guarantee this is a clear and easy to follow paper. If you do that, then you're going to be certain that you're arguing for your thesis and that it's clear for the reader. So when you're asking yourself, what should I do next, or how should I structure this? Ask yourself, what would a lazy, stupid, and mean reader need at this point to come to believe my thesis? And this is why there's no one right answer. Yeah, a first grader should not be drunk, but if there was a drunk one, you'd want to be able to explain it to that drunk first grader. So yeah, just also general life tip, don't make first graders drunk. It's bad life choices. But lazy, stupid, mean. So also another thing, I got a concussion once and I was like fuzzy headed, right as if your professor is concussed. Also, another thing, a more accurate one, I'm gonna be reading about 100 papers in a week's time. My brain will be zapped. Therefore, the easier you make it on me to follow along, that's gonna be a better, clearer paper. So that's what you should ask yourself. And this is why there's no right answer, because what you think you need to do to explain things to the lazy, stupid, mean, drunken first grader is what you think you need to do. And this is where the creativity comes in. Depending on what you think is a good reason, it's going to be somewhat different from everyone else's. Now, there's going to be clearly bad reasons, and there's bad ways of doing it. If you're too vague, if you're unclear, those are all things that are going to not lead to a good paper. But there are many ways to do it correctly. So don't hold yourself to too high of a standard. Your paper will never be perfect. Nobody has ever written a perfect paper in human history. So don't beat yourself up if you're like, is this perfectly correct? So now,
Professor,
say that again.
I like the way how you think that there is no perfection, and that's why I was going to ask you about the paper, that if it needs to be like if it was about like research or just like the opinion that we have about it.
So here's the way to think of it. It's a little bit, it's somewhat an opinion, but it has to be a defended opinion. So at the end of the day, you're gonna have to, like, your thesis is gonna be the thing you believe. It's your opinion. But don't just explain to me why you think it's the case or that you think it's the case. Explain to me why I, the person reading it, should also believe it's the case. Think of it like an opinion piece in a newspaper, which no one reads anymore. So an opinion piece you find online. Something like, you should buy this because it's the best Christmas gift and here's why. Well, in the same way, this is something you should believe about this case and here is why. So along those lines, you're convincing not just anyone, but the laziest, stupid, meanest reader. And so what are some, as I said, there's no one right way of doing this, but some general guidelines or tips. Anything you can do to make it clearer is good. So that means anytime you bring up a new term, define your term. And when you're defining your terms, don't just give me a definition of it. First, give me a definition, then explain that definition and maybe even give an example of it. So for instance, if you were writing a paper on why your phone tracking devices are bad or why they shouldn't be allowed, like the Google shouldn't be allowed to track where you are at all times. One of the reasons you might say is, well, because it's a privacy violation. So you're going to want to define what you mean by privacy. So you're going to want to say something like privacy is being left alone. For instance, you have privacy when you're alone in your house and no one else is around. So that's what I mean by define. Don't just give a general term like privacy is something we like. Or in this case, don't just say utilitarianism is a thing. Say what exactly utilitarianism is that makes it different from other views. Or if you're defining cultural relativism, don't just say this cultural relativism is a view that morality is relative to culture. Explain to me what that means. Prove to me that you fully understand it. And do that by explaining it in a way that the laziest, stupid, meanest reader could understand. So that's one thing. Define your terms. And along with that, add in examples. So after you say something, if you say one reason that you shouldn't shoot someone is that it's going to have bad consequences. Well, don't just say it's going to have bad consequences. Say what some of those consequences are. If you say one of the reasons that we shouldn't have tracking on our phone is the government could track us down and do nasty things to us, don't just say nasty things. Tell me the sorts of nasty things that they could do. Talk about how if they decide that you are, if you're engaged in peaceful protests that they don't like, knowing who you are and where you live could be used against you. So more detail is always better. Why? Because to get someone to believe your thesis, the way the human mind works, generally, the more detail, the more particulars you can give, the more persuasive. This is why if you want to really upset someone, don't just, this is just like a general stat and a great quote from, I want to say it's Stalin, some terrible world dictator once said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Why is it that when you hear 20,000 people died, it's hard to wrap your head around, but if you read one very detailed account of a child being killed, it can really get you emotional? Well, it's because more detail gets us more like engaged, more persuaded. So don't be afraid to use examples to illustrate your points. Well, a general vague statement like this would be bad is true, or this would have negative consequences is true. It's better to add detail and examples to say what these are. Really explain to me what these things are and why they aren't good. So
we're allowed to use outside sources, right? So when we're using these definitions, do you want us to cite all of our sources for the definitions as well?
Let's actually do that. We'll jump down here to the language and citations bit and the quotes bit. So do you have to use outside sources? No, you do not have to. If you would like to use outside sources, may you? Yes, absolutely you may. So if you want to include a definition from somebody else, you are welcome to use their definition. So you could say a definition of cultural relativism is, first thing we're going to do is define cultural relativism. James Rachels, a philosopher, defines cultural relativism as, and then you put it in quotes. So if you're going to use quotes, some things to keep in mind. One, always paraphrase your quotes after you give them. So if you do this, don't just say cultural relativism according to James Rachels is quotation. Say, follow that up with, by this he means that, and then put a paraphrase in your own words. Same thing with any sort of definition or any sort of passage. Now, in terms of citing it, I know as a professor, I'm supposed to care about MLA or APA or Chicago. I don't. The fact of the matter is there are many people out there who are going to teach you how to correctly cite things. For me, all that matters is if the plagiarism police were to come down from above and be like, hey, did this person cheat? Where is their source? I can say, they gave me a hyperlink. So if you include a quote, say where you got it. If you use outside sources, tell me what they are. And by that, I literally mean at the end, you can just include a hyperlink that says this is where I found it. Mostly because if it's an interesting one, I want to read more about it. So yes, if you're going to cite things, tell me where you got it, but I don't care about the format. I don't care if it's the name, then the parentheses. You can literally just say class reading or URL, and then you literally just Control-C, Control-V it. Gloria, do you have a question? Oh, no. All right.
No, I didn't.
Okay, just making sure. All right, so that's with quotations. If you're not someone who wants to use outside sources, these paper prompts are written. So basically, you're probably going to want to reread the readings for class. But even if you don't cite them, like your paper can end up being fine. So don't stress too much about having to use outside sources. If you want to, they can make the paper stronger. If you have a news article, if you have anything like that, that's fine. Personal stories or personal anecdotes are fine to bring in. Just about anything that you think will prove your point is acceptable and good. Literally anything goes, so long as it's clear how it ties back into your thesis and you explain how it ties back into your thesis in such a clear way that even a lazy, stupid, mean reader would understand it and understand why you're bringing it up. Which ties in with this next thing that's circled. Explain the significance of something. So if you say that privacy violations are bad because they put you, they'd allow the government to track you, explain why that's such a bad thing. Say why it's such a bad thing. Or if you say cultural relativism says everyone is equal, therefore we can't judge them. Explain to me the significance of why we couldn't judge them if cultural relativism is true. Explain to me the significance of why the fact that different countries have different moral codes or seem to have different moral codes is proof that cultural relativism is true, or explain to me why the fact that people have shared cultural values regardless of where they come from. Explain to me why that shows that cultural relativism isn't true. Really, after you say something, and don't be afraid to literally say, this is important because it shows, or say something like, as this example demonstrates, it is bad to punch puppies. These are the sorts of things. Do not be afraid to literally come out and say, this demonstrates that. And don't be afraid to literally, if you say something complicated, to just rephrase it in different words. So if you say something like, privacy is very valuable because it allows us to stay safe. Don't be afraid to follow that up with, by that, I mean that if one does not have total control over one's life, one cannot be sure that others will not manipulate them without them knowing. Or if you say something like, I believe that the devil is evil and cannot be trusted. By this, I mean that this is relevant to this particular case because yada yada, something along those lines. So don't always err on the side of extra or more clarity. So does that make sense? What I mean by adding in this extra information, making sure it's as crystal clear as possible. Force your reader to understand what you're saying and what your reasoning is. Beat them over the head with why you are correct. At the end, if I, at the end of the paper, am just like, wow, this person came at this from 5 different angles and they went in real depth on every single one, that's a good paper. If I can read the paper through one time, know exactly what your thesis is, and immediately see how everything ties back in, those are the best papers. The strongest correlation with high grades is, can I read the paper through one time and understand exactly why you're saying what you're saying? If it takes me a few read-throughs, generally that's a sign that the paper is not as clear and not written for that lazy, stupid, mean person. All right, another thing to keep in mind to make the paper easier is, and easier for the lazy, stupid, mean reader to follow, is keep it well structured. So what does that mean? Well, it means that each paragraph focuses on one topic and everything on that topic that you want to say is together in the paper. So put all your key definitions together in one section or save them for whatever part they come up in. Candy Best, how much emphasis should we give to the other side, if any at all? I will come back to that question in a second. The answer is this is in the it's up to you category, but I'll say a little more detail on that in a second. But in terms of one topic or one issue per paragraph, if you're giving reasons that you should shoot your best friend, and one of your reasons is utilitarianism, and the other one is you'd feel really guilty if 10,000 people died and you wouldn't be able to live with yourself, put those in separate paragraphs. Don't say one issue is that I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Another issue is that utilitarianism says so. I wouldn't be able to live with myself because I'd be sad every night. Plus, according to utilitarianism, the greater good for the greatest number is what's right. Jumping back and forth like that would confuse a lazy, stupid, mean, drunken first grader. So instead, cover all the things on one topic. Start it off with that signpost. And this is why I wanted to encourage this signpost assignment. Give the signpost, cover everything on that topic in one paragraph. Then once it's done, you can move on to the next paragraph. And each sentence in that paragraph should be tied into that topic. Don't include random information. If you're going to include a story about your grandmother that isn't relevant to that particular topic, don't include it in that paragraph. If you're talking about utilitarianism and you want to tell a story about your dog that has nothing to do with utilitarianism, but has something to do with a different element of your argument, maybe how sad you get when things die, well then save that for a different section. Make sure everything in the paragraph relates together and everything related to that topic is in that paragraph. Don't jump around. The more you jump, the harder it is to follow. I'm sure you've been told a story by a small child before. Small children are so good at jumping around and confusing the hell out of adults. So think about the last time you talked to a kid and how hard it was to follow their story, and try to avoid doing that in your own paper. Tandeep's question, how much of an emphasis should we give to the other side? So for each of these arguments, there's two sides. One of the side is the one you're arguing for. The other one is the side you're arguing against. So one of the ways you could prove to the lazy, stupid, mean reader that you're right is by showing that the other side is wrong. And very often the strongest papers at least address what the other side might say and why that's incorrect. However, you do not need to do that. If you're reasoning for that you shouldn't shoot your best friend, you just want to talk about utilitarianism and why it's right and not even consider the possibility that you shouldn't, that's an okay approach. However, you need to go into a lot of depth. On the flip side, if you say, these are all the reasons that I'm right, oh, and also these are all the reasons the other side is wrong, then that can be an even stronger argument. So it's really, short answer is it's up to you. Long answer is it can be very helpful, but it needs to be framed and et cetera, et cetera. And I generally, I mean, my personal preference as I write, I often find myself bringing up what the other side might say, but that's just a personal tick of my own writing style. And it can show that you understand it. Like if you can understand and argue against the other side, that's usually a good sign that you really understand the topic, but that's not the only way to show you really understand the topic. Was that helpful? Did that explain it, Tandeep?
Yes, thank you, Professor.
All right, perfect. All right. I have paraphrased quotes and complex things. Don't be afraid to paraphrase, as I say, yourself. If you say something vague or unclear or you're not certain, don't be afraid to add another sentence that says, in other words, or by this I mean, or if it's somebody else, by this he or she means. So again, trying to make it as crystal clear. And this is why these papers feel a little different than writing for other classes. You're going to be going very slowly, moving a little bit at a time and making sure to explain everything fully. Tied in with this is it is better to go into just a couple things in a lot of depth instead of going into a lot of different things in just a little bit of depth. Very often people are tending, you get to about page 2 of the paper and somebody's like, oh my God, I got to get to the page limit. And you start throwing ideas at it. It's better to take a step back, pause, and go in more depth on just a couple things. So if you have 7 reasons to think that you should shoot your best friend, just focus on 2 or 3 of the best ones so you can define all the key terms you need. So you can explain, one reason I should kill this person is because utilitarianism says so. Then what you could do is say in depth, this is what utilitarianism is. This is what it would say in an average case. This is how it applies to this case. This is what someone else might say in response and why they're wrong. Is there a specific way to cite my lessons? No, honestly, I don't even care if you cite the lessons. If you just say like, we talked about it in class, or even just ignore it. Like if you're citing something, I have a pretty good memory. So if you're citing something I said in class, I'll probably remember saying it. So don't really worry, Pamela, about exact citations of what we talked about in class. But yeah, it's better to go in more depth. Generally, anytime you say something vague, try to say something that specifies it. So if you say something's going to be bad, explain what the bad consequences would be. If you say it's unjust, explain what you mean by that. If you say it's unsafe, say what sorts of things could happen to you. If you say that they're morally, if you say that they're dangerous, say why they're dangerous. If you say that the devil is untrustworthy, tell me why you think they're untrustworthy. Just a good tip for as you go through and write the paper, go back through and ask yourself, why did I include this sentence? What does this show? How does it tie back in? If you can very easily do that, you have the level of clarity in your reasoning that will make it easier to follow along with. Another thing, just a general tip, is read your paper out loud to yourself if you have a chance to. You'll feel like a crazy person because you'll be sitting there in the corner mumbling to yourself. Back when the world was open, a very fun thing to do would be to read your own paper to yourself on the subway. You get some really fun looks from strangers. but it's a very useful way of catching sentences that don't make any sense. When you're in your own head and you're not saying it out loud, something can make sense. But the moment you say it out loud and it exits your head and then comes back in through your ears, things that sounded totally normal in your head can clearly make no sense. So basically, the clearer you can be, the better. And one way of making sure you're reaching the level of clarity is to read it out loud to yourself. If you're somebody who's comfortable with other people reading it, give it to someone who's in the house and be like, does this sentence make sense? Another general tip is start ahead of time. I'm somebody who has both started papers way in advance and also crammed things the night before they were due. It's just a sad fact of the matter. Sometimes we have to cram, but the other side is almost always that the paper is, the farther out you start, the better the paper is. I can say from my own experience, whenever I pulled all-nighters and wrote papers, they were pretty crappy. So the farther out you can start, the better. In so doing, you allow your brain to just kind of digest, think about. Also, you know, the way it works, your mind gets tired. Writing is not easy. So stepping away allows you to recharge. So try to take time, step back. Once you finish writing, give it a few hours, then go back to it. If it's all possible, I know it's finals time. So this might not always be possible. Good news, you can cram and write a decent paper. It's easier to write a good paper if you start a little bit ahead of time. One last thing with the lazy, stupid, mean reader bit. Lazy, stupid, mean readers don't have big vocabularies. One of the easiest things to do as a writer is to fall into the trap of you have to use big words and complex sentences. That is not true. Rather, it's very often good to use smaller, clearer words. If you want to talk about the negative consequences, you can just talk about the bad consequences. You don't have to say the deleterious effects on human well-being. Use the shorter phrase. The shorter phrase will be clearer and easier to follow. So don't just use big words because somebody at some point incorrectly told you that big words are a good way to sound smart. In a paper like this, the ideas are complicated enough. You don't need to add extra difficulty and extra levels of complexity. Keep it simple. Really, I have never told anyone this sentence isn't complicated enough. I have often written this sentence is too complicated and your words you're using are too big. Clarity is the name of the game. Other things, as I talked about last time, don't be afraid to use I. Don't be afraid to use me. Don't be afraid to use my. These are totally fine to use. Another thing, I am grading this paper on the quality of the ideas and how easily I can follow. So because of this, I only care about things like spelling and grammar and punctuation if they prevent me from understanding what you're saying. So if you were to write something like, you can get my point if you thinks hard enough. This is grammatically incorrect, spelled wrong. I wouldn't care because I know what this means. This means that you'd understand my point if you think about it hard enough. That's totally fine for this paper. Over time, you're going to want to write clearly and get your spelling correctly. But I, in this class, am caring about the ideas, and that's what you're being graded on. This is something very often professors lose sight of the forest from the trees. And I think it's much easier if you're not putting in the mental effort of spelling things correctly and getting the grammar right. That's something that can come later. Good grammar and good spelling is never going to make a good paper by itself. So therefore, no point worrying about that till another time. If, however, you were to write something that just made no sense, like you aren't thoroughnessly angry enough sometimes, right? Sometimes, right? I would have no idea what this means. So this is the difference. If you can read it, if I could understand, and it's sometimes going to be unclear, but if it's basically, don't worry about spelling so long as I know what you're talking about. Don't worry about grammar in terms of punctuation. Don't worry about capitalized letters. That's not the stuff that you should be putting your brain power into. Don't worry about there versus there versus there versus there, which isn't a spelling of any word, but you know, I don't care about this stuff. It's much, much better to put the effort into making sure that your ideas are clear and that the paper is well structured. Which ties me into paragraphs. And this is something I said last time. There's no correct number of paragraphs for a paper, and there's no correct number of sentences in a paragraph. It's a matter of what you need that paragraph to do to illustrate your point. What do you need to, how many sentences do you need to explain this particular reason that defends your thesis? It can be one sentence, it can be 50 sentences. It really doesn't matter so long as it's clear. Also, basically paragraphs are your friends. You should change paragraph when you're changing gears or changing topics within it. So only change the paragraph when you're shifting gears, but if you're shifting gears, make sure to signal that by putting a new paragraph. That'll make it easier for you to know, like, oh, that's right, I've changed paragraphs, I should talk about something slightly different. And the reader reading will go, oh, new paragraph, I should be expecting a signpost that'll say what's coming next. All right, so those are the general meaty sorts of things. Again, the best way to make sure you're writing good paper is remind yourself, what would somebody else need to hear so that they would understand what I'm trying to get across? And that means small sentences or small words, simple sentences, clearly defined terms, examples that illustrate the points, explaining to someone why you're saying this, how it supports your point, including quotes, but then paraphrasing the quotes to show you know what it means. Make sure each sentence has a role in each paragraph, and each paragraph has a role in the paper. If you're trying to convince your mother to get you a PlayStation for Christmas, or you're trying to convince your best friend where you should go to dinner, you're going to want to, in the same way, keep things simple, make things clear. You might be like, they have the best pasta there. In particular, they have a lobster dish, a lobster ravioli that is just my absolute favorite. That's what I'm talking about. Here's a general statement, they have the best food. Then you give an example that says they have this incredible lobster ravioli. Then you say, this lobster ravioli is the reason we should go because it's been voted the best ravioli on the East Coast by so-and-so. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. You say a general point, you illustrate it, you explain it fully. That's how you're going to convince your lazy, stupid, mean reader that what you're saying is correct. All right, everyone on board with these general terms? That's basically all the substantive stuff about the paper that I want to say. The goal is just to convince me by beating me over the head with your own thinking. Any questions on that stuff? And then I want to talk some practical businessy things, paper number or page numbers and that sort of stuff. Any questions? Are we good? All right, so if there's no questions, things I want to say quickly. The paper prompt itself says 3 to 5 pages. Now, this is a recommendation. I will never take off points just because your paper is too short. I will never take off points just because your paper is too long. I do not care about page limits in themselves. They're an arbitrary number. What I do care about is that your argument is good. And these page number suggestions are simply there because I have found that papers that fall within this range generally have the level of detail that makes the argument effective. So if you go much under 3 pages, it ends up being, you don't have enough time to say everything you need to really argue the thesis. Once you go over 5 pages, what very often is the case is that the person's only over 5 pages because they've lost track and they've started rambling a little bit. So you want to make sure that you stay on topic and you explain yourself clearly, and that you don't have unnecessary tangents that aren't directly tied to the thesis. So usually that means that it's going to fall in the 3 to 5 pages range. If, however, you write 2.5 pages and you're convinced that you've said everything and it's clear, I have given just a straight A grade to someone who turned in a 2-page double-spaced paper. It was a really clear, concise, excellent paper. I've also given A's to people who've turned in 10-page papers. I've given A's to somebody who turned in a 12-page paper. As long as it's clear, as long as it's in enough depth, and as long as you're not just adding things in that don't immediately tie back to the thesis. So just treat this as a recommendation. Next thing to say is, again, citations, don't care about the format at all. If you want to include a works cited, fine. If you just want to put some URLs somewhere on the page, fine. If you want to practice your MLA formatting and get all the periods and dots and everything else right, great. But I will not be grading you on it. Lastly, I'm going to send out an email about this. Drafts. I'm willing to read over and give feedback on paper drafts. However, because the paper is due next Tuesday, it is due the end of the day next Tuesday. So that means 11:59 p.m. on next Tuesday, but I'm not going to be grading things at 11:59 p.m. So as long as it's in my inbox or on the Blackboard by Wednesday early morning when I'm going to wake up and start grading, then I won't take off points. But because of that, and I've got a swamped week, so I'm going to need maybe even like a couple days to turn around comments on drafts. I need drafts by end of day Thursday. So if you want to whip up something, it doesn't even have to be a complete draft, and get it to me by the end of the day this Thursday. So like 48 hours from now, I'm happy to read it over. If you don't want to give me a draft and you just want to have office hours and talk about it, great. You can do that up until whenever. I have a lot to do this week, but my schedule is totally flexible, so we will certainly be able to find a time. If you have any shorter questions that you just want to shoot me an email about, that's fine as well. I'm basically here to give you whatever assistance you need in writing this paper. Any questions on that business stuff? Can I get a thumbs up or something from someone? I just want to make sure someone's alive still.
I have a question.
Yeah, Gloria.
When do we get the feedback for the outline?
So very good question. I am going to, as soon as this class is over, going to be downloading them off the Blackboard and grading them and giving you the feedback tomorrow. So if you have not gotten an email from me from tomorrow and you turned it in, reach out to me ASAP, because it probably means I mistyped your email address. So expect it though tomorrow. It'll definitely be in there tomorrow. I have started grading them already. So yeah. And
okay,
again,
thank you.
Yep. All right. Any other questions on any of this stuff? And again, any questions you have at any point. Even if it's something as simple as, Professor, I'm nervous, I'm not sure I'm doing this right, can I just get some affirmation? That's fine. If it's literally, Professor, this sentence, does it make any sense? That's fine. Really, I'm here to help you, and I want to provide you all with whatever assistance to make the end of this semester as well. It's going to be painful because, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but as low pain as possible. All right. So any last things before I finish up? Any questions before I shut off the recording and just do some last minute business stuff?
I have one question.
Yeah, Nick.
So I know you want us to put I into it, like say like I think this, I observe that, but
Yep.
Do we have to do that just to make it more personal? Or is it if you don't?
You don't have to. It's just that's not necessary. I personally like writing that way, but that's a personal tick of mine. You don't have to do that, but what I'm saying is you're allowed to, which is a lot different from many classes where they say don't ever use the word I. So you do not have to use that. You can say things like this paper will argue that, or even just saying something like utilitarianism is wrong and here is why, or utilitarianism is wrong, and then you just list the reasons. But if you want to include I, you're allowed to.
Okay. Also, one last question.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, for some reason my speaker is being very quiet. And so I'm leaning forward to get next to my computer, which is why I look like a crazy person whenever anyone asks a question. All right, Nick, fire away.
Now, the signpost assignment, if the actual, not the draft, but the final assignment we sent to you is different from the signpost assignment, is that gonna affect the grading?
Oh,
one?
thank you for bringing that up. No, the signpost assignment was to force you to start thinking about it. If you end up writing a paper that does not adhere perfectly to the signpost, that is fine. I just wanted to encourage you all to think about it. If you totally veer off, even if you're like writing and you're suddenly like, I want to change my thesis, or I want to change which prompt I'm writing about, that I'm not going to take off points because you've totally audibled and gone with something different. That was to encourage you to think ahead of time.
Okay,
Also, if you turned in a signpost assignment, you're getting full credit for it. So do not worry about the quality of the signpost assignment. It was really low stakes, just did you practice? Any other questions? All right, in that case, I'm going to stop the recording and then I will just say some last words and then send you all on your way. All right.